Good morning. Just for the benefit of the tape and those watching on parliamentary TV, could I all ask you to introduce yourselves and your organisations, please? Can I start with you, Lisa, who's doing this from Zoom? Lisa.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Lisa Smith, and I'm chair of a small charity called the Advisory Council for the Education of Roma and Other Travellers. And we are a group of people that consists of community members and academics.
Thank you. Could I just ask the sound people if we could turn Lisa up a bit? Could I just ask you to speak slightly louder for the next question, Lisa, if that's okay? Thank you. Pauline.
Good morning. I'm Pauline Anderson, and I am here as the chair of the Traveller Movement, which is a London-based charity. I'm also Director of Learning, Inclusion and Skills for Derby City Council, a former head teacher, and I'm an Irish traveller.
Thank you. Please, Baroness.
I'm Janet Whitaker, and I think I'm here as the chair of the Department of Education's stakeholder group for the education of Gypsies, Traveller and Roma. I'm also the president of ACERT, which I think you've had evidence from. I needn't spell it out. And of Friends, Families and Travellers, and co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group for Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. I think that's about it.
Thank you. Emma.
My name's Emma Nuttall. I'm Advice and Policy Manager at Friends, Families and Travellers. We're a national charity that works with Gypsies and Travellers, and we do outreach work in Sussex, and we have a national helpline with casework as well as policy work.
Thank you. We're going to try and finish just after 10:45, so if I could all ask you to be as concise as possible with your answers. Could I just start off just asking you all how were Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities impacted by COVID in terms of their educational attainment? Can I start with you, Pauline, please?
It's very difficult to judge educational attainment because of the national suspension of national examinations, so that would be extremely difficult. Even at the best of times, there are more challenges with children who are being home educated, in fact, if they are Gypsies and Travellers. But what I can say is that due to some of the excellent work with our own Open Doors Education and Training ODET group, we have provided online and virtual education, and children have made really good progress. Attainment has been high, attendance has been high, and this has led to the expanded programme, the further £1 million programme, which is really leading to a lot of success. So there have been some gains in learning during the pandemic.
Thank you. Janet.
Well, Pauline's really closer to the ground than I am, but I have had very many cases reported of digital exclusion problems, because you have sometimes quite large families with one phone between them. I needn't spell out how that's worked with distance learning, which is always a problem for travelling families anyway. The department, of course, has invested in tutoring programmes to help catch up, but I see in their news release that they mentioned that their delivery partner is Randstad, and there have been some questions about that. So I think monitoring of that programme is really important. The last thing I would mention, that there are still children who haven't gone back to school for various reasons, and elective home education is a real problem for these communities. The parents, with the best will in the world, sometimes they're too busy working, and they're not necessarily very well equipped to teach children. I know my own daughter had problems teaching her child. So there are those three areas which have caused problems, and I think the only way to find out what's really happening is to monitor the tutoring and to pay attention to these school attendance.
And just before we come on to Emma, you mentioned home education. In our home education report, where we call for a national register and for annual assessment of maths and English once a year, And we had some evidence from the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community which suggested that a lot of that because the home education lobby is dominated by often middle-class parents, it doesn't therefore reflect what the help that often is not given to disadvantaged communities. Would you agree with that? And do you support,
if I could yes,
absolutely. Do you support the idea for a national register?
And I could just add that
can I just finish? Sorry. Do you support the idea for a national register and at least an annual assessment of core skills like maths and English?
That would be really, really important. It's my impression that the government have agreed to set up a register. We have had questions in the House of Lords about that, but it hasn't happened. It's a very important policy. I mean, there's a very large number of children who receive inadequate education, often with the best will in the world, as I said, and nobody really knows about it.
You look like you wanted to say something.
Yes. So in my role in Derby, I have elective home education in my remit. So I would really welcome those recommendations. And we actually do already fund people who actually visit the homes, and we visit about 95% of our families. We have access to them at least on an annual basis, and we have a register of those children and young people, including the reasons for elective home education. I think it's really important to continue to look at reasons. And my offer to any family of children being home educated is that, as Director of Education, I will attend any school visit with you if you wish to return to school. And I will personally attend the school with you to help.
You agree with the idea of annual assessments of maths and English?
Yes, absolutely.
And more help. Thank you. Sorry, Emma, thank you for waiting.
That's okay. Yeah, I just want to echo what Pauline said. Actually, it's looking at the reasons. We support the measures, but often the reasons we find with families we're working for is that it's a position of last resort, that they haven't received the support in the school, there's been bullying or there's been issues. And I think to try and resolve those issues, what you need is a traveller education service in every local authority, because they know the families, they work with them. We have a very successful one in Brighton and Hove that has a peripatetic teacher, an engagement officer, and it's about to appoint a teaching assistant as well. And quite often those teaching assistants are from the community as well. And then it can kind of try and resolve the problems before they get too far down the line that the family opts for home education.
Thank you. I just have one final question before I'm going to pass to my colleagues. The ONS, Office of National Statistics figures on the national curriculum at Key Stage 2 suggests that Gypsy, Roma, Traveller communities at pupils are the lowest performing group, with only 19% reaching expected standards in reading, writing and maths. There's other figures that you will know about. Key Stage 4 destination figures showed that only 58% of Gypsy, Roma and 59% of Irish Traveller pupils continued in education, and that's compared to 85.3% of pupils from a white British background. Why is it that the educational attainment of these pupils is so low? I'll start with you, please, Lisa.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Well, I would first of all, if I may, like to make a general point about statistics. There simply aren't enough of them in the right areas. The Department for Education is among the best. But even they, I think about a year ago in our stakeholders group that I mentioned, it was agreed that they would disaggregate Gypsy from Roma. These are very different communities, and they have very different approaches to education and educational experiences. I mean, for instance, very few of the Roma travelled. They were enslaved until the last half of the 19th century, which tends to do away with the travelling culture. And so that's an important thing. And education statistics would be enormously assisted if the Department of Health and Social Care, the Ministry of Justice and DLUC, because all their spheres of action impact on education. Evictions impacts on education, poor health impacts on education, poor experiences of the criminal justice system impacts on education. So there's a real dearth. People will say, if you ask them, well, the numbers are too small. It's true, the absolute numbers of the populations are very small, and if you're doing a big, broad national sweep, they're left out. But that means you've missed the really important factors. So there has to be a revised and amended attitude to research. It needs to be targeted, perhaps in the form of targeted surveys. So the figures you see, even from the ONS, and we did manage to get some extra granular material into the census, even those do not give a really useful enough picture. But that's not quite what you asked. Okay. What you asked is why.
Yeah, in a nutshell.
I think my two colleagues will be able to give you more background detail, but one of the really important things, I think, is the lack of appreciation, understanding, or valuing of Gypsy, Traveller and Roma culture in schools. There are some schools which are really very good, but they are a minority, and one of the related aspects of that is there's a lot of bullying and there's a lot of prejudice. Now, if you've got low self-esteem, you tend not to perform well, you tend not to push yourself. And very, very often, if you're a Gypsy or a traveller, you drop out, particularly secondary school. So those two areas, really understanding how they get bullied and valuing their culture, I think would make a huge amount of difference.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, please. You hear us? Yeah, thank you.
I hope that you can hear me okay.
Yes, thank you.
So in ACERT's opinion, we would say one of the single most effective initiatives to happen to raise the achievement and attainment of young Gypsy and travellers in school would be to strengthen protection of young people whilst they're in education. So at the moment we have the public sector equality duty, but unfortunately many schools are failing to adequately protect children under that. And I think there needs to be very strong and firm behaviour policies and anti-bullying guidance that specifically in a national context mentions Gypsy, Roma and Travellers within that. I have to agree with everything Baroness Whitaker says. There seems to be a severe lack of awareness, understanding and education of who Roma and Traveller people are in society and the contributions that they make in many different ways. And there was one recommendation that came from the Council of Europe that called on the 47 European member states to embed and include Gypsy, Roma and Traveller histories and teachings about language, the Holocaust, into the curriculum. And this doesn't have to be extra capacity in terms of extra hours, but there are simple and effective ways that this can be embedded into the sessions that already exist. So I would say this would be one crucial direction for young people, because many people are feeling alienated and on the margins in school where their identity isn't reflected or represented. And for many people, there is still a concern where young people will not be open about their ethnicity or their background in education because of fear of potential treatment. But I would say some practical steps that could be taken by the government to improve outcomes would be to include Gypsy, Roma and Travellers under the pupil premium, like we see with those who are servicemen, because we need to recognise the multiple disadvantages that Roma and Traveller children experience across the sectors, not just in education, but in health and access to appropriate accommodation as well. Another recommendation that we would say that could have an impact on improving outcomes would be for Ofsted to have an opportunity to specifically ask questions around the low attainment of young people from this group when they're taking out inspections. And another thing just related to the recommendations around the direction from the Council of Europe would be to have a strong support for Gypsy, Roma and Traveller History Month within schools. Something else that we find from ACERT's perspective in terms of creating more inclusive school ethoses is where we have dedicated members of staff who are from the communities embedded in the school workforce. And this is something that we'd like to see more of, because they bring so much value to the communities they serve in terms of raising awareness about Romani history and culture in the school, providing a role model to other children, but also a bridge and trusted source where concerns with, I would say. So those are a few points that I would say, if that answers your question.
Thank you. I'll come to Emma and then Pauline and then Tom, and just if you could be as concise as possible. Emma.
Yeah, I would echo all the points that Lisa said. We find that there's a lot of our clients reporting a level of discrimination and racism in schools, which is coming not just from pupils but from teachers as well. So you need training of staff on Gypsy and Traveller cultural awareness training. The Anti-Bullying Alliance has produced an audit tool as well as some online training. We're working, a group of us, on a pledge for schools, which is kind of echoes the pledge for Gypsy and Traveller into higher education. And the pledge is to create a safe, warm, welcoming environment in schools for Gypsy and Traveller pupils where the culture is celebrated. And it's very important to celebrate the culture in History Month in June, but it's also very important to mark the Roma experience in the Holocaust, because research by YouGov has shown that 55% of the UK population don't know that Roma were a victim of the Holocaust. And to mark that in schools is a kind of goes some way towards working on hate crimes and discrimination and racism.
Have you spoken with the Holocaust Educational Trust?
Yes, we've written a letter to the Education Minister.
About the Holocaust Educational
Yes,
Trust?
and they've supported it. I think there's 40 signatories on the letter, and they're one of them, the Anne Frank Trust, the Holocaust Memorial Trust. Yes, so all the NGOs working in the Holocaust field are very supportive. That
Pauline, and then I'm going to come to Tom and then Miriam. Pauline.
I think it's really important to note that there is a direct correlation between obviously attendance at school and achievement and attainment. So where children are not attending, you know, how are they going to learn? It's very difficult. I'll give you my own experience. My mum never went to school. She is barely literate. I did teach her the basics when I was about 11 years old. That was my first teaching job. And then I became an English teacher, so I must have graduated upwards. The important thing for me was that my parents told me that I must never tell anyone that I was Gypsy Traveller at school. And so we go into ethnic self-denial, and that is extremely damaging for children and young people. So the reason I believe that in one generation, going from living on the roads of Ireland and never going to school and becoming a head teacher and a director of education is because I actually had to hide my ethnicity. So it shows that children, young people can achieve if the conditions are right. So I did not experience racist bullying, I did not experience low expectations, and I was able to thrive. So I think that's really important, and I think that links to Lisa's earlier point about low rates of ascription. Many children who are succeeding in education from Gypsy and Traveller communities are actually very successful, but they're not ascribing. So there is a hidden number of children who are counting among the majority population, and I think that's really important. Otherwise there can become an underlying view that all Gypsy and Traveller children are incapable of learning, do not achieve, and are experiencing some sort of underlying issue with education. That's not the case. So I think freedom from racist bullying is really important, and it is all connected. So what I would say is that, you know, I would like to bring back the reporting that used to be done on the perpetrators and victims of racist bullying in schools.
Explain what used to happen.
Well, a number of years ago, it was stopped, but every school had to report all bullying incidents by ethnicity to the local authority, but you know that could be a different mechanism. But actually, so that was analysed, and there was a national data set then on the bullying and
when was
statistics.
That stopped?
Now you're testing me. At least 10 years ago, I would say. Yeah.
Okay, that's a very important point. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much for that useful information. As the chair drew upon at the start, you know, some of the statistics. I mean, I understand there can be a debate about statistics and whether there's enough data, but I mean, I think we know enough to know that there's a problem in terms of achievement at schools. I mean, whether we think there's enough data or not, I think is slightly different point, but it is quite alarming, you know, the stats in terms of progress and writing, reading and numeracy. So we're just to get into this point, trying to understand fully why there is this discrepancy. I can understand why valuing of the culture is an important point, and I think we all stand against any kind of bullying and racism at schools. But I was just wondering whether you think there's any other reasons, potentially, to explain this quite alarming set of statistics about performance at school. I mean, is there anything to do with potential attitudes to formal education within those communities? Do you think that's a problem? And thirdly, in terms of attendance, because I've known that's been a challenge within my constituency, and in fact there's a number of schools have done some fantastic work in terms of driving up attendance, but actually what they found is when the schools closed during the pandemic, everything sort of went backwards, and it was a real challenge to sort of get them back into school at good attendance levels after they'd sort of stopped attending when the schools closed. Just wanted to know what your feelings were on that.
Well,
yes,
no.
Yep.
I think it's like any group of people. There are people who want to achieve, do well in school, and are, you know, striving for maybe an academic or professional career from the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people. And there are people who perhaps, you know, want to go into businesses. You know, perhaps formal education isn't necessarily for them. Maybe going into, you know, sort of building trades, etc., like many of my family. And so you do have a variety, and I think the difficulty we have is about stereotyping. So, you know, could you put me alongside another person and say you are exactly the same, and I wouldn't put you along the side as alongside perhaps someone, a painter and decorator, you know, who's very different from you in your profession. And I think the difficulty we have is about stereotyping and making assumptions that all gypsies and travellers want the same thing from education. However, we are seeing an increase in young men particularly, clearly needing, even if they're going into the trades and professions, to have better levels of literacy, to be able to access health and safety courses, you know, bookkeeping, all that kind of thing. So, you know, I am an educationalist, and I actively promote education for Gypsy, Roma and Traveller young people, because whatever you choose to do in life, a good education will serve you. But we may all end up doing a different kind of job.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Miriam next, and then with the other witnesses. Miriam.
Okay, thank you. I think partially answered the question. So we talked about what changes schools need to make in order to be more welcoming and affirming and encouraging of Gypsy, Roma and Traveller children. But we've started to touch on cultural attitudes within the community itself. So you're saying that, you know, we can't stereotype. There is just as much variety within the traveller community as there is in any other community. But you've also said, I think, according to our written evidence, that there are long-standing community beliefs about girls and the need for girls to have education. So I just wondered if you could, starting with you, Pauline, expand on that a bit more. So I understand we can't completely generalise, but what kind of attitudes are you talking about there in terms of girls and their need for education?
Well, traditionally, in the past, there would have been a view that, you know, girls, you know, married very young and had children very young, and you know, that education was not necessarily that useful to them. But all the statistics are telling us that actually the growth in education and the length of stay in education and moving into higher education is much greater among women and girls than among boys.
In the travel community?
In the Gypsy and travel community.
Not just
myself included, Lisa Smith included.
So that is something more in the past now?
It is a reducing factor, as you know, as people find they you know, have aspirations to, you know, to join the professions, etc. But of course, that's not what you see on the media.
Okay, interesting. So just opening up to the others then, are there any other kind of cultural attitudes and traditions that you think may account for some of the trends we see in terms of attainment, school attendance, and leaving early? Lisa, I'll come to you.
So I would say, as Pauline, I'm a member of the Roma and Gypsy community, and I would say I would agree and echo what Pauline said, in that I don't think as much currently attitudes around this are the cause. I think we need to take a view on this as that it's a systemic issue. where traditionally Romani and Traveller people have been on the margins, excluded from society, and there is often an assumption when we talk about the inequalities that Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people experience to think about this from a deficit model where we have an assumption that there's something inherently wrong with their culture or their way of life, which is why there is a significant problem. But now there are very few people who are consistently mobile. Many people are being in housing or on a private site for a big proportion of the year because of the difficulties in maintaining nomadic existence and being able to still at the same time access health and school education. So I would say actually that, for example, now when we see children who are stable, they have permanent accommodation, they are still experiencing the same difficulties in terms of stereotyping, low teacher expectations, assumptions about that person's background and family experience. So I would say what's fundamental for us as a British society is to highlight and address the systemic issue of anti-Gypsyism that other European countries have started to get a grasp on and are addressing. And I think this is a fundamental issue because when we think about Romani and Traveller history, we need to be thinking in terms of it being a fundamental part of our culture. So I think there isn't a reflection of the fact that Romani and Traveller people were subject to the slave trade as well back in the 18th century. There isn't a recognition of us with our own languages and dialects. There isn't a strong recognition of the Holocaust that took place in other European countries and the significance of increasing Roma people coming to this country. So I would say, overall, we really need to reflect.
Can I just come in?
Yeah.
I completely understand what you're saying, and you're describing much needed changes that need to be made in school and wider British culture, and I completely agree with you. But what I'm trying to get at is there anything within Gypsy, Roma and Traveller culture that is still a barrier to children accessing education? Now, you've said that people move around less than they used to, and that's very interesting. It makes a lot of sense in terms of what you're saying about accessing services. But yeah, I'll come back to you. But are there any specific cultural traditions that are from within the community that are stopping the access to education?
Yeah, in a nutshell, please, Lisa, because we've got to bring in other witnesses.
Okay, I would say as well, one significant issue would be education. Parents or another family member who hasn't had formal education, not knowing the system and how schools operate and how they can best support their child. And I think partnership with local authorities and schools, working with families really from the earliest stage, that earliest years, where we know that's where the most significant change can take place. Okay. So I think a lack of education around the system. Thank you.
Baroness and Emma.
Just to underline what Lisa says, vis-a-vis parental attitudes, there has been such a long history of mistrust of the public services. I would draw the committee's attention to the inquiry now being carried out by the Public Services Select Committee on Gypsy, Traveller and Roma in interaction with the public services. They had an extremely interesting, useful dialogue about education a few days ago. And the trouble, I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which the parents will have had bad experiences with the authorities, the system. Not all parents, but enough to make a difference, I think. So unless the schools make particular efforts to liaise with parents, to understand their anxieties, to understand their problems, I think this is probably going to exacerbate the situation.
Thank you. Emma.
Yes, I mean, 50% of the families we work with are illiterate or partially literate. So that is the barrier. And then there is the digital exclusion barrier. For instance, in the pandemic, if a family wanted a computer from the school to borrow one, it's a family with 5 children, they're only allowed to borrow one computer, or they have. So that is a big barrier. We did obtain some laptops from charities, but you know there's a limit to that. So it wasn't that easy for people to access IT for the homework. And we've had instances of children getting detention because they haven't done their homework, but that's all online and they haven't got the device to access it. There is a need for funding for courses for younger Gypsy and Travellers that want to follow a trade or another occupation, but the funding isn't really, we're finding the colleges and the schools don't have the money to pay for, say, children between 14 and 16 to attend those courses. There is the issue of sites for families that are still nomadic. There is a lack of sites. Families that don't have a site are pushed from pillar to post, evicted 50 times a year. We work with families like that. If they're living on the side of the road, the policing bill is only going to make that worse. And you have this strange situation that the few local authorities that have a remaining travel liaison officer might be going around looking for, they know what school's got an empty place, they can find a place for, say, 5 children, we've had this, and then the local authority officer evicts that family, all that work gone in. So that's the importance of traveller education services, that they can facilitate nomadic families quicker into school. They know where the places are, help with uniform. I think it's really important to have properly funded traveller education services, because these have been decimated, but they did used to be. Every local authority needs a traveller education service. They know the families, they often have Gypsy and Traveller people working within those services. They can help when there's a disengagement beginning to appear in a pupil or a family. Also, after-school clubs and homework clubs. We run some after-school clubs on sites in Sussex. We've got a computer club. A lot of the children, it's the first time they've even used a computer in the computer club. Homework clubs.
Sana.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. I just wanted to actually pick up on what Emma, you were just saying just now. In your organisation's written evidence, you state there was a lack of support received by families who are digitally excluded. How can schools themselves provide the appropriate support to pupils from these backgrounds to prevent them from being digitally excluded?
Well, if the children and young people don't have access to a device, that is a major barrier, so that every child that needs one needs access to that device and needs the help to work out how to use it. You know, some people have never done Zoom calls, never done email, can't access the platforms for the homework. So I struggle myself with my son. So there does need to be help available so that families can access, not just have the device, but access the technology. And
I mean, your evidence, I mean, it was just quite, you know, the figures, 1 in 5 Gypsy and Traveller participants had never used the internet, compared to 1 in 10 members of the general population. It's quite a big difference. Yeah,
and lower amounts of our digital exclusion research found that only 38% had access to broadband or Wi-Fi at home, compared to 58% in the general population. That was in 2018 we did that research. So, yeah.
And just to the panel more widely, to what extent has online learning contributed to disengagement with education from Gypsy, Roma and Traveller pupils? Maybe Pauline?
I think one of the key issues is the ability of families to actually oversee that education. If Janet's daughter has struggled, then many families did struggle during the pandemic to actually deliver home education, and they may have been graduates themselves, even teachers, and it was a challenge for everybody. But I think low levels of literacy in some families, it's obviously going to be very difficult to oversee and deliver a quality of education. I actively promote attendance at school. I think that's really important, and I think we just come back around the cycle of needing children to be in front of qualified, skilled teachers.
Can I just ask, I mean, we know that the policing bill is currently going through, it's having its passage in Parliament. I mean, how concerned are you about provisions in the bill around trespassing and you know, traveller sites, for example, and what risk that poses to children accessing education? Is there a risk, for example, of more children being left parentless if their parents are arrested and they're taken away from their families? I just wanted to get a sense, because I think this inquiry is pretty timely and you know, is looking at the overall picture. Yeah.
The risks are huge, and so already when there are evictions, children suffer. So they're plucked out of school. They may come home from school. We've known of families where children come home from school and the site's not there anymore, but social workers are there to take them to wherever the family have moved on to, etc. So it is extremely damaging to children and their education. And the Police and Crime Bill makes it a lot worse in the sense that it can be, that the bill will be more draconian, vehicles will be removed, etc. And that, that trespassing will bring this sanction. And, the whole thing comes back round to the shortage of sites. Bearing in mind that between 80 and 90% of gypsies and travellers live in fixed housing, not on sites. And it's very easy when you look at the media and watch the television, read the newspapers, to imagine that we are all living on sites. And that is not the case. It's quite a small minority. But to protect the nomadic traditions of people who have been travelling for hundreds and hundreds of years, it's best to have sites, and then you do not have the issues of trespass.
I mean, it's one of those things that I thought about, because I think what I've heard from a lot of people in the GRT community is that this is like an existential threat. I mean, it's an attack.
It makes it impossible
the very
to travel.
Tradition,
yeah,
the very definition. Yeah.
It is.
Lisa, just want to bring you in. So. Don't know if you want to. Yeah.
Hello there. Yeah, just really to echo what Pauline just said there. I think there are big concerns within the community that it will increase the numbers of children into social care. This is a big concern. And also from our perspective at ACERT, we think it will make it more difficult for young people to access education if they're more increasingly subject to evictions. So I think overall the police will have a detrimental impact on the life chances of young people in education, no doubt.
I would echo that. We're extremely concerned about the policing bill. For children to have a good education, they need to be able to stop somewhere and have a home. And the issue is that there's actually a severe shortage of local authority sites on which gypsies and travellers can stop. And in the interim, you can have negotiated stopping. You can have agreements between local authorities and travellers that people can stop. Children can go to school for a term, and you can have it quite long term. We've seen local authorities that have allowed families to stop for a whole term to attend school. It doesn't have to be this draconian way. There's lots of local authority land where people can stop on for a short while in the interim of having permanent sites and transit sites to facilitate the nomadic way of life.
Thank you.
You're next. Could I just ask you to, if possible, you could ask both your questions together.
Okay.
Just for a bit of time, then we'll get all the witnesses to answer.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, panel. My questions are on bullying and racism. We've already touched on it, but the 2019 report, Barriers in Education for Young Travellers in London, found that 60% of those that were interviewed found that they were bullied by teachers because of their ethnicity. So my question to you first, Pauline, is what do you think needs to happen to tackle that? And what do you need to tackle it?
Thank you. Yes, well, as a teacher myself, I experienced the racism as I was about in my mid-20s, I would say. I hadn't actually told anyone I was Irish Traveller, but as I began to be part of teacher groups and working with people, I did begin to see the racism at work. And I suppose that spurred me on to becoming a more openly activist. I chair the annual conference of the Traveller Movement, have done for 14 years, and last November Daniel Kabede from the National Education Union acknowledged that there was racism against Gypsies, Roma and Traveller children in his own profession, and has invited the Traveller Movement to work with the NEU on educating teachers about cultural heritage and requirements, and basic human rights, if you like, and not to be racist in teaching. I'm not saying that this is the case in all schools, but in too many cases that the children are telling us. So what I would recommend is a deep dive review by Ofsted into bullying, and that to include all aspects of bullying and culture and ethos in schools. I think it should listen to parents, listen to children and young people, and I think listen to teachers, because as a teacher myself, you know, it can be a challenging profession and people do need more support in being able to meet the needs of sometimes quite complex people.
And do you think that disciplinary action should be taken against any teacher that has found to be bullying and racist towards children, young people in schools?
Well, that should already be part of any HR policy in any school. If that were found to be the case for any other ethnicity, then there would, without question, be disciplinary action. I'd fully expect it to be taken.
Thank you, Pauline. Janet?
Could I commend the Irish government's National Traveller and Roma Inclusion Strategy? It's got some very use. The committee might be interested, and also Ofsted have reorganised themselves, and they have got some very useful long history of dealing with the education of these travellers. We used to have somebody on our department for education group. They're now thematically organised, but there is a Gypsy and traveller advisor who I think would have a lot to help the committee with. Well, I have the mic. If I could just say, I have a copy of our letter to the Secretary of State for Education. When I say our, that's about 300 or 400 parliamentarians and others, about putting the Roma element of the into Holocaust education if the committee would find that useful.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Kim, do you want to ask your next question, then we can bring in...
So my next question, and maybe you could come into with that, Emma, was about the disproportionately higher numbers of exclusions from school from Gypsy, Roma Traveller children. And again, what is the reason and what can be done to reduce those levels of exclusions? So
if I just give a short overview, because...
Can you make it very snappy?
Very short, okay. Let me leave it to them, because they'll have actual examples.
Oh, Emma.
Okay, so just going back to your last question and kind of blending in the two, I don't think it's surprising that there's the level of racism experienced by students from staff in schools, because there's such a high level of racism and prejudice in wider society towards Gypsies and Travellers. The Equalities and Human Rights Committee found that Commission did a study into prejudice and found that 44% of the UK public hold prejudice towards Gypsies and Travellers, and then the University of Birmingham did a dinner table prejudice study. It was actually about Islamophobia, but they found that 43 or 44% held that level of prejudice against Gypsies and Travellers, and the amount, the next highest in the EHRC to Muslims is 22%, so it's significantly higher. So you're going to find that reflected in all walks of life, which is why it's so important to create the right atmosphere in schools to celebrate the culture, to implement the Council of Europe recommendation.
Diversify the curriculum?
Yes, to diversify the curriculum, to have Gypsy and Traveller staff. And we find that sometimes with exclusions that it's kind of it's the end of a long line of things happening, whether that be the racist bullying by pupils, whether that be by staff, whether that be digital issues. It's kind of a long line. You know, one family we worked at, the parent was actually in a refuge for domestic violence, and she in the north of England, but they were based originally in Sussex. She was driving her child down from the north of England. Such was her commitment to school, but the school weren't taking into account all the things that those children in that family had been through. So again, I'm bringing it back to travel education services as well. If they know the families, they can support the families. It's a kind of bridge between schools.
Pauline.
Thank you. So I was part of the expert panel for the Timpson Review of Exclusions in 2019. Very similarly to the Women Inequalities Committee, recommendations were made by both of those reviews about tackling inequalities, and the difficulty there was post the Timpson Review no implementation plan. So how was this going to be taken forward? So in my role as Director of Learning, Inclusion and Skills for Derby City Council, I thought, well, I can't be on the expert panel and do nothing back in my hometown. Went back to Derby and began 3 years ago to tackle the high levels of exclusion, which is for other disadvantaged groups, not just gypsies and travellers, I will say. So we're looking at all groups, but what works for one disadvantaged group often works for the others. We had 62 permanent exclusions in that first year in Derby, and that has a massive effect on every child's life. Over 3 years, we have reduced that to 4 permanent exclusions. We have devised something called the Fresh Start Plus, where you have to come before a panel of your colleague head teachers and say, we have tried absolutely everything for this child. We've worked with the family. This is what we've done. And you show the graduated response and what you've done before coming to the point of exclusion. And quite often, coming to panel, it was obvious that the schools hadn't done, a quarter of those things. So actually, it's been peer. Obviously, I initiated it, but I've developed a peer-led approach through the in-year fair access protocol. Given strong leadership, had a lot of pushback. I'll give you an example of a new academy trust that's come into the city. It's recently had a new head teacher, new trust, and we saw a spike in exclusions, particularly for Roma children. Immediately, we put it through the Fresh Start Plus, went back in to talk to the CEO and the head teacher, and in the last few weeks, we've begun to see, their exclusions beginning to come back down again. So you have to take direct action.
Thanks, Pauline. Thanks for sharing that programme.
Can I bring Tom in, please?
Just following from what I was saying earlier on, I mean, I don't doubt that there aren't significant improvements can be made within the schooling system to sort of better understand the unique cultures in which we're talking about today. But it seems to me that perhaps when you're talking about things like integration and understanding each other, I mean, it is to an extent a sort of two-way process, and it does seem a bit like today. The statistics we've seen, it seems as though you think it's entirely to do with the school system not being sensitive enough and not understanding enough, and really that there aren't any specific challenges within the community that need to be worked on and addressed. Is that the case? Is that?
Well, I'm here today.
Pauline, if you could just answer this one.
So I'm
please.
here today as a member of the community, taking direct action, devoting my entire life to promoting fairness in education. So what I would say to you is, I think many of us are taking positive action. And so, your underlying assumption is that there is some kind of fault within the community, and therefore, people are not achieving because there is this fault. And I think that is a very stereotypical view. And I think that, it's exactly what you'd see if you read the newspapers, you see the television. I think probably it would be good if members met more people from the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people. You would meet more academics, you would meet more lawyers, you'd meet more nurses, you'd meet more activists, and begin to see that actually, those people probably are hidden.
So there's no specific issues.
Hidden in the statistics.
So there's no specific issues within the cultures
Certainly not.
to do with attitudes towards education or anything like that?
I think I exemplify that's not innate.
Okay. Can I just ask you just a final couple of questions, but I'll merge them together. Given we know that Gypsy, Roma, Traveller communities are going to face problems within school, how important is early intervention? So the moment, should resources be targeted at early intervention with mentoring for families as well, real direct targeting at these communities? And if I could just ask you, in terms of the catch-up programme and also the £1 million education programme announced by Lord Greenhouse in terms of supporting Gypsy, Roma and Traveller children, what's the impact of this programme? So if you could answer both together. Can I start with you? And we're going to finish in literally 2 or 3 minutes. So if I could just, because of broadcasting restrictions.
The impact of the £1 million programme?
So on early intervention.
Early intervention?
And you don't have to answer both, but also the impact of both the catch-up programme.
Yes.
Because you mentioned Randstad, and also the £1 million programme announced by Lord Greenhouse.
Well, there's general broad evidence that early years intervention is really, really useful for all children. And it's particularly important for children who are at a risk of being marginalised. I haven't seen evidence of the impact of early years intervention on these particular communities, but there's no doubt that it will be really important. And Catch-up. Again, I don't think the department has done very clear evidence of how it's working. I've heard lots of examples of it not working, but it's really up to the department to show how it's working. And as for the 1 million, again, we haven't heard what exactly the programmes are in those areas, but I would hope, as Emma says, that there'll be more emphasis on traveller education liaison people in every educational authority. Digital inclusion. Further education, you probably haven't got time to touch on, but this is a very important area for Gypsy and Traveller people because it's an entrepreneurial culture, but because of the secondary school dropout, they quite often don't have the credentials which actually they're intellectually capable of. So I'll leave it at that, but there's a huge area there.
Lisa, did you hear the question? Was your internet on at the time? Are you on mute?
Sorry, please, could you repeat that?
Were you able to hear our question about early intervention, how important early intervention is, and also the catch-up, how the catch-up programme has reached these communities, and also the £1 million announced by Lord Greenhow?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I could just comment on the £1 million programme that's been announced. Whilst we very respectively are very happy to see that there's some commitment, we fear that this isn't enough to really address the systemic historical challenges and real underachievement going forward. We feel like such a programme would need to be...
So how much is it that...
better funded?
How much is it you would need?
And that there is much research.
How much is it that you think would be the right number?
That exists on how we'd like to say thank you, but we feel that more is needed to be done, targeted, effectively evaluated, and then funding given for follow-up for it to be sustainable. Thank you.
Emma, in a nutshell, if you can.
Yes, well, the recent Education Recovery Commissioner, Sir Kevin Collins, he stated that there was 15 billion catch-up fund was needed nationally, yet only 1.4 billion has been allocated. So 5 billion has been allocated. Oh, right, at that point there was. Yeah. But so obviously we welcome the million, but it really is a drop in the ocean, and we do need, as Lisa said, it to be properly embedded in ring-fenced funding for traveller education. And
how much
services.
do you think would be the right number?
Well, it would be good if every local authority in the country had a traveller education service, or if not, a dedicated officer. So
how much do you think is the right number?
Well, it's hard for me to state the number right here now, but I'm sure we could get someone to cost it.
If you could and send it to us, that would be great. That would be great. Finally, Pauline, thank you.
Yeah, I think the value of the early years, the evidence is there for all people, all communities, and I think this connection with families and actually, working with the whole family in the earliest intervention is the very best thing, because there is a distrust of the education system, and some families do not want to entrust their little one into a school where they may experience racism, bullying, name calling and so on, and which happens right from the age of 4, not being invited to parties, 20, 30 children being invited to a party, and the Gypsy or the Traveller child in the school, in the class, isn't invited to the party. That's how it begins to happen at a very, very early age. So early years education should include aspects of working with a Gypsy, Roma and Traveller families specifically. In terms of the catch-up, it has been difficult nationally, so I know there's only just been a data return to the DFE on catch-up, so we don't actually have, we haven't actually got that data back yet, but we do know there has been difficulty in accessing high-quality tutors nationally, and also you would perhaps say it's even harder to attract tutors who understand how to work with Gypsy and Traveller communities, so I think that's been a challenge for everybody. In terms of the £1 million, we as the Traveller Movement have actually been part of that work, and we've built on various other programmes during the pandemic which we implemented, online tuition, and we've really had a fantastic success. Very, very high attendance, if you like, engagement, very, very high progress, allowing for very, very targeted support, one-to-one tuition, and families have really reported that children are re-engaged with learning, some of them wanting to come back into full-time education because, you know, they found they can do, and it's given them the confidence that actually I can be a learner and I can achieve, and I am inside society and not outside.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's really appreciated. It's been invaluable evidence, and I really wish you well. Order. Because of time, we're going to start the next panel straight away, please. So, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Thank you very much for coming today. Just for the benefit of the tape and those watching on Parliamentary TV, can I ask you very briefly to introduce yourselves? We're going to try and finish at 11:40, so if I could ask you to be as concise, all of you, as concise as possible with your responses to us. Thank you for coming. Marius.
Thank you very much. My name is Marius Chuka. I work with an association called Gypsy Roma Support. I am a Roma myself, from Romania. I study business at University of London Metropolitan. I'm very happy to be here. We are involved together along with my colleague Vasile, very closely to the Ipswich Roma community from Ipswich, and I hope we can bring a positive.
As all of you as concise as you can. Paula, please.
Hello, Paula Strachan, head teacher, St Teresa's Catholic Primary School in Darlington. We've got 91 Gypsy Roma Traveller children in school at the moment.
Perfect, thank you.
Morning, Vasile Sanders, my name. I work at St Matthew's Primary School as a teaching assistant and translator, along with Mr. Maris in Ipswich Roma Support.
Thank you.
Jo Luman, I'm head teacher at King's International College in Camberley, but I'm here due to my 18 years experience working at Ash Manor School that had 10% of students were from the Gypsy community.
I should have asked, how would you like to be addressed? Is first names agreeable to everybody? Thank you. Can I just ask, I'll merge my questions together because of time. What is the reason, in your view, for the underattainment of so many of Gypsy Roma Traveller communities in education? How have they been affected in terms of education with the COVID pandemic? And is, in your view, the catch-up programme reaching these communities, and also the 1 million announced by Lord Greenhouse? If I start with you, Marius, and again, I just urge everyone to be as concise as you can.
Thank you very much. Well, in my opinion, I believe that there is a lack of support amongst the schools within the area that I am from. Some of the schools do offer a lot of support to the Roma communities, and some have shown great improvements, but some other schools don't have. And I believe one step further would be to offer young role models from within the community that can represent the community, so that they can feel represented somehow.
There's a lack of high expectations from some educational colleagues for these children. these children will achieve the highest expectations if the opportunities are given to them. We have links with Sunderland University where we've got degree graduate students who are sharing with children what they can achieve. And I think the big problem is a lack of education among professionals about what these children can achieve if they're supported effectively.
Thank you, Vasily.
During COVID, we have supported Roma students because they didn't have access to a laptop or tablet. We was going to their houses and give them what to do because they couldn't access the internet, and parents couldn't work with laptops. They didn't know how to do it because of didn't go to school, but it really affected because the time that we was off.
I think it's quite a complex issue. Schools can do it. They can make the attainment figures higher. We are here because of what we've done at our schools. The engagement with the curriculum, especially at secondary level, is quite difficult. Progress 8 has not been helpful, if I'm honest, because actually what kept the students in our school was the option of doing vocational qualifications, which don't count in Progress 8. So if you're a head teacher who is being viewed by Ofsted under a data point, and you've got 10% of your students not completing qualifications that count in Progress 8, where is your motivation, unless it's that moral imperative, to actually do something about it? I think the move away from data-driven inspections has been helpful, but we do need to look at that qualification set at GCSE level that might be used by schools, because if you think about T-levels, which we really want to encourage students to go into, which are vocational, why have we not got that being replicated at 14 to 16 education? Attendance is obviously a key issue as well, but that wider cultural capital, if you actually look at GCSE questions our students have to complete, some of the language, some of the experience that it relies on students having completed in their life need to be put in place. Just simply, a maths question might turn around and say, if you buy 4 tickets at the theatre in the circle, it costs this. Well, if you've never been to the theatre and you've never sat in the circle, how on earth would you know what that means? And that's not just for children who are from Gypsy or Traveller backgrounds. That's any child from a disadvantaged background. So it is about education. It is about educating the professional community. It is about having that teacher education service to support schools. In Surrey, where I'm from, I have to pay for Traveller Education Services as a secondary school. We don't get it automatically. It costs me £90 an hour for one person to come and work with one child. I get no pupil premium money for that. There is this impression that Gypsy or Traveller students come with pupil premium money. They do not, because they haven't claimed free school meals.
Okay, thank you. Tom, you're next.
Okay, just at a specific point, well, firstly, thank you all for coming, particularly the representatives from Ipswich, of course, you know, the best place in the country and everything else. Apart from Harlow. Well, yeah. I'm not sure about that, but in terms of the attendance point, because I have spoken to some head teachers in Ipswich who there were some really encouraging signs in terms of attendance improving. And I think you sort of touched upon it with the laptop issue, but they said, but when the schools closed at the start of the pandemic, and when they reopened later on, it was harder to get some of the Roma kids back to school compared with the other groups. I'm just trying to wonder why you think that may have been the case. Secondly, my second question is to do with apprenticeships and skills. Do you think that's a particular issue, and maybe the fact that we've had an education system that hasn't always promoted apprenticeships and skills enough may have had a particularly negative impact on the Roma community? And thirdly, do you think that there is a risk that if the education system doesn't engage and do enough to support young people from the Roma community, there may be a risk that they get dragged into crime and antisocial behaviour and things like county lines?
We'll start with you, Jo, please.
I'm not convinced actually the county lines thing is an issue. From my experience working in Surrey, where we have got some county lines, actually I found that most of the families we work with are exceptionally protective of their young people, exceptionally protective. And actually the children aren't going out in the streets being, being approached, because they're actually at home, or they're doing boxing, or they're working with their horses, or they're working in the family. So I don't think the county lines is an issue, but I stand to be corrected on that. I think I'll pass to my colleague, who's may know more, working with that community more generally now.
Yeah, I think mostly is a lack of understanding about attendance. Parents doesn't really understand the system here. They doesn't know the education system. They think that they can be a day off or two off without saying why and how. But since I'm talking from my own experience, since I've been at St Matthew's Primary School, I have engaged with the parents and I've told them and I've explained how important is the education. They didn't know about that, and I think that educators need to be educated as well. They need to be educated about the Roma community, how they are, how they think, so they can understand them. Because I've experienced with Lucy Hood Senko from St Matthew's. We went to a school and they said, "Oh, Roma community, oh, Roma people, why do you care so much about them?" Because they don't like school. They don't like school because they don't feel safe in a school being with others. Like they don't understand their culture, they don't understand their language, and I think it's a big impact on attendance. That's why they off so much.
We're actually seeing a change in our attendance, Tom.
Yeah.
When fathers are travelling for work, mums are now choosing to stay at home with the children because we've shared with them how important education is. And one of the things, when our children join us in our nursery in our early years, we explicitly explain the attendance procedures to them, so there's a clear understanding right from day one.
Thank you. In regards to county lines, we've had a meeting back in the days when I was working with St Helens Primary School as a teaching assistant. We, as my colleague said, the Roma community tends to be very protective of the children, and they won't allow them to, as soon as they see something strange, they question it, and that's something that it's tackled as soon as it happens. In regards to attendance, when I was working at St Helens Primary School, we were physically going after them in order to make sure they're fine, they have everything they need, so they can attend school and have great results. Obviously, some of the parents lack the education, lack the the responsibility not as a parent, but as a educator in their family to emphasize that onto the children. But that's where we come as professionals and as role models from within the community in order to make sure to teach them and educate them in regards to how important the school is. And I believe we can do that.
Thank you. Any more questions, Tom?
So there's been some really great improvements, and it's really heartening to, and I'm aware of the work that both of you do and how valuable it is. But in the past, and perhaps to a diminishing extent, but maybe it's still a little bit now, there just is perhaps a certain sort of attitude, particularly when it comes to sort of attendance, that maybe it's not critically important to be there every day, and maybe missing the odd day might not be the end of the world, and that's something that needs to be addressed.
That applies to every single family, I think, in the country. You have parents who have an attitude about attendance. I don't think that's the reason why they don't attend. I think it's a fear. If you've had a difficult day the day before, or you've been bullied, or you've been subject to racism, why would you then come to school the next day? Ultimately, head teachers have a responsibility to create a vision and the values in their school that mean they are inclusive, they celebrate diversity. We can do it. But it's down to us as educationalists to change the attitude in schools, which will then support the communities to attend.
Okay, well, I've listened to all the panellists. Thank you.
Thank you. Miriam?
Yes, okay, so following on from that, Vasily, you mentioned how you've spoken to parents about the education system and kind of helped them understand a bit more about what's expected. Is there anything else that you can do, that you do to help engage parents, to help them support children? So particularly we've heard from previous panellists and in evidence that there can be lower levels of literacy and numeracy in parents, which obviously makes it harder for them to support their own children. So kind of from your experience, what can schools do in that space to kind of help parents have the skills they need to support children?
So what we've done before COVID, it was coffee mornings for Roma parents, especially with me on my target that I had few like 10 to 15 parents every single morning attending to speak about school, to speak about life, and also we have printed some jobs and the money that they can get. So I can encourage parents to encourage children to continue school, because they can get like 40,000, 50,000 a year from being a mechanic or to be a qualified person, and they was really up to it. They really encouraged their children. And also what we've done, it was teaching them English. We've done ESOL classes with them, so they can know how to understand the system here, so they can know how to ask for something if they go to the bank or something like that, so it make their life easier for them and for their children especially. We help them in school and outside of school as well. That's what we've done.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to add to that in terms of specific?
I think it's about having a trusted adult for the parents. So we've got trusted adults in school who specifically work with that parental group, and we will read documents for them. They often bring documents in that they're unsure of. It's about identifying what the needs are and making sure that you accommodate them so that you're serving that community correctly. But I think the trusted adult and that early years intervention is key, because we're finding that when children join us, they don't leave. So once they've had that lovely nursery experience, they stay with us right the way through.
Mario?
Yes, I want to emphasize what my colleague said. From within the community, we tend to, have role models in order to hire them and get them into the schools or wherever. It doesn't necessarily have to be schools. It has to be maybe GPs or wherever, so that we can gain the trust of the community. When they see someone from their community, they trust, and the bridge is created much easier. So that's one thing we can do, to look for role models, because there are so many who have attended, who have great results and high attendance at high school or college or universities. And I'm happy and I am proud that there are young Roma role models who can represent the community. And I believe you can look and choose from within the community that can help the Roma community progress.
Thank you. And Joe, anything specifically from a secondary perspective that can be done for parental engagement?
I think meeting off-site initially when you're doing that transition, because we lose children who don't transition into secondary school because there's that fear.
I was going to ask about that, because we had, when we were looking at disadvantaged white working class communities, we found that parental engagement makes a huge difference. And we met the Felsted Academy, and who do a huge outreach work going to parents' homes and so on.
Yeah, being trusted that you can go into their home and have a cup of tea, taking that transition experience of doing the paperwork outside of your school environment is key. And if you can find locations in the community that will work, we found it was very successful to get the transition between primary and secondary working. But also ensuring that their first visit is something to celebrate. If their child is singing in the choir or they're performing in something, then they're more likely to come, and every member of their family will come. And then once they've had a positive experience, then if you do have to have that difficult conversation, it's not so scary. And us employing somebody from the Gypsy community was the key to getting our attainment figures up and our attendance. It was the one thing that made the difference, because that trust suddenly became there.
Wow. Thank you. And then moving on to special educational needs, we've been doing an inquiry into children in care, and one of the things we found that for children who didn't have an adult that knew the system or could persevere with the system or keep pushing for the support and the certificate and whatever else they need, they really struggle to get the support they need. Is that a similar experience, particularly for parents who don't speak English, and what can be done to kind of help children in the travel community with special educational needs to access the support that they need? Shall I start with you,
We'll just get Paula to answer.
Oh, sorry, yes, Paula.
Paula to answer this one.
It's the trusted adult again. It's having colleagues that you are working with who want the very best for these children. So if a child's SEN, no matter what their ethnicity, you fight for them at every point. But there is also the potential for that community particularly to be targeted inappropriately. But it's that trusted adult who's going to fight for those children.
Caroline, have you finished, Miriam?
Yes, that's fine.
Caroline,
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to ask a quick follow-up question with regard to parental literacy. Quite a lot of the primary school education homework and such things requires a certain amount of parental support, which is going to be very difficult to provide if your levels of literacy are not up to providing that support. So are you aware of any programmes to support parents in improving their literacy? Is there any work being done by maternity services or health visitors to identify parents whose literacy is poor in a way that's going to make these things difficult for their children as they get a bit older into school? Are there any programmes available for those parents to go into to improve their literacy themselves?
Marius?
As far as I'm concerned, not at the moment, but we used to do in the past. We invited parents, as my colleague said, when I was working at St. Helens Primary, we had parents coming in and we would do ACERT classes, but also educating them about the system and what are the requirements. And in terms of literacy, we didn't do much to teach them alphabet or anything like that because it was difficult. We'd rather spend time educating them, about the responsibilities as a parent when it comes to the child. But in terms of educating like literacy or anything like that, that was beyond me, I believe.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I would say that there's no national programme. What's happening is individual schools are identifying the need and putting something in place. And you have to think about adult education programmes. A lot of them are in the evening. For most families, that isn't accessible because they have childcare. If there was a childcare support available that was free, you might find that more families would then engage in a literacy programme that would specifically help them to do the forms. The SEN process is the most complex thing for anybody. But actually, you've got to have the package, not just the programme of literacy support that allows them to access it.
Okay. Paula?
We've offered courses during the day for parents, and some of those have been really well attended. We also run a homework club specifically for our Gypsy, Roma, Traveller children so they can have support with their homework. And we've discussed with parents about activities and a different way of doing it. For example, in nursery, we send home story sacks. Well, it's quite hard to read a story, but actually you can talk about the pictures and the different characters within it. So we've done a lot of training on the ground.
Thank you.
Any more, Caroline? Apsana.
Thank you, Chair. So I just wanted to ask a few questions around bullying and racism. You obviously were here and heard the last panel. So I just want to understand what you think needs to be done more to reduce bullying of Gypsy, Roma and Traveller pupils within schools. And just to touch upon the point made earlier, obviously we're aware now as a committee fully that there isn't a requirement currently to record incidents of bullying, particularly including recording of data around protected characteristics. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what actually needs to be done. Maybe come to Joe first.
Well, in Surrey, we do report prejudice-related incidents, so we do have to collect that information. So that is very useful to have it on a school level, but you can have it on a county level. You have to have a zero-tolerance policy. It is quite simple. If you have a zero-tolerance policy about bullying and you are consistent and you are fair, then actually people then trust you and then they'll tell you that it's going on, because that's the hard bit.
What does that mean in practice, a zero-tolerance policy?
It's making sure that the students actually see that there is a consequence and it's not hidden away, and that they are going to be listened to and they are going to be believed, and you investigate it fully and you don't jump to conclusions. But that again comes down to ethos, and it comes down to your values, and it's also about engaging the parents. Sometimes it may be about getting the parents in and having that conversation with their child about an incident that's happened to get to the bottom of it, because you find out sometimes you have a conversation, they go home, and the children say something completely different that they said in school. But it is about, open door policy, being available to talk these things through all of the time. And being as the head, the person who phones up those parents. And don't rely on somebody else to do it, because ultimately it's my responsibility.
Do you think Ofsted need to be empowered to hold schools accountable on this?
Having just done my Ofsted 2 weeks ago, they absolutely did hold me to account for everything. They went through all of my paperwork, bullying, talked to all the students, talked to the staff. I have to say it was exceptionally rigorous. It was a good experience, but they were holding me to account, absolutely.
You want to come in, Paul?
Yes, I also keep records that have got protective characteristics listed on them, but I think a lot of it starts with the staff team, and I think there needs to be a zero-tolerance policy there on any sort of racial or derogatory language being used, because that then passes on to the children that we serve. And I think it's also about educating about misconceptions about Gypsy, Roma, Traveller children. All of our children have visited the local camp to get rid of any of misconceptions that they may have. We have stories that have Gypsy children at the very centre of them, and we share those regularly. When we've interviewed our children, they say they are not bullied in school, that they experience racism every day when they leave the school gates, which is heartbreaking to hear, but it's the world they're in.
I came in England in 2012, and I want to share something from my own experience, that I've been bullied in school because I didn't know any English at all. Children were swearing at me, were kicking me, were slapping me. I couldn't tell the teacher because I didn't know how to tell him, how to do it. What do I have to tell the teacher? Since I've learned, the time passed on and I've learned English, and it was different. I think there is needed a key person in school from the community that you can talk to as a Roma student. That really encouraged me to work at St. Matthew's Primary School, to help Roma children not to be bullied, to learn, to be keen to attend school, and to have a future, to have a qualified job, not working in a chicken factory like all of people thought that you know, that they're not qualified. So that really encouraged me. I think there is needed a key person in school to help children and not to be bullied, because they can talk to that trusted person.
I'll just ask one more question. So we've seen what happened with Brexit in terms of the increase in racism, and the Roma community in particular were targets of that racism. We've seen the policing bill go through Parliament at the moment with provisions around outlawing trespassing and criminalising parts of the culture of traveller communities. And also we've seen sort of really high-profile examples of jokes being made about the Roma genocide, for example. And I just wondered, is there anything that you can share in terms of what impact this is all having on the GRT community overall, and how it's manifesting itself in experiences of children and teachers and others in the education system?
Is it okay if I?
Yes, please.
I believe people are, whenever this kind of, jokes or these kind of things happen, people are starting to look onto the community, onto the Roma community, pointing much more fingers than before, and bringing them down. But in order to avoid having bully the children or the community, or to have racism, I think it has to be implemented a curriculum about the Roma values and their history and what they have done, and they're not meaningless people, and they're not like the trash of the society, because many people, the bullies start when people are considering that community lower in terms of society level. But when when people are educated and they know what Roma people stand for and their values, probably they avoid doing that, because as we know that the British community, they are and powerful. They've done great things in Europe and that kind of stuff, and that's basically what we have to do.
Just one follow-up.
Sure, of course.
Specifically for Joe and Paula, I think maybe is there a risk that in trying to support the GRT community in experiences of racism, discrimination in the education system, that taking an approach of trying to get them to assimilate as such, trying to target them, sort of trying to take this approach of like, you should be this way and making assumptions is wrong, because and that there is a danger in falling into that trap of trying to say, well, you need to actually meet these targets, you need to make sure that, and just taking that really sort of narrow approach is a risk as well, because it doesn't necessarily understand actually the cultural norms and practices of the community itself.
Yeah. Want me to go first?
Yeah.
I think there's a complete misunderstanding of the nomadic culture and how it aligns with educational attainment. Children learn an awful lot when they are travelling, and that doesn't necessarily fit into our standardised education system.
I think it is again about not necessarily fitting in, it's celebrating the culture. And I think what Lisa said about including the history of the Holocaust is really important. That should be required, that it's in there, where you can put those opportunities. But it works for any ethnic group, any, disabled children. It just applies to everything, is that actually our curriculum and what we do in schools has to be more inclusive in general and not...
When they teach the Holocaust, don't they include Roma and...
It's very briefly mentioned.
Right.
It isn't.
It's part of the syllabus.
It is part of the syllabus, but it isn't necessarily something that's focused on. And then when you get, as we've seen in the media, those sort of jokes and people laugh, actually, if that had been embedded in the curriculum, would it have had the response that it had?
I'll ask you, how damaging was the so-called comedian's comments? Jimmy Carr on Netflix, and what should be done about it?
I think it's exceptionally damaging. If we want our young people to have positive role models, and we want all of our young people to not laugh at jokes like that and understand how serious it is, we've got to have good role models on mainstream media. And that was completely unacceptable. And it's really hard when you've got young people, and you're trying to... You can't justify it.
I agree with my colleague.
And how damaging it is, have you seen the impact that comment has done on communities?
I personally haven't seen it yet, because where I work, they are like little children. They doesn't know yet and haven't seen probably the joke, but I think there is a big impact on adults, especially young people in high schools. I think there is the big risk to be made again, that kind of jokes to the Roma children.
Walla?
Young children are talking about it, and families are very upset at the amount of laughter that circled round after the joke was said.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. It's amongst young adults who attend high school, because they are much more with the media and all that, and they suffer the most. And I believe there has to be some, awareness about it, and raise awareness and let people know that this is not something to joke about.
What should be done about it, in your view? So what should have happened? Should Netflix have I think it's Netflix that had it on. Should they have taken it off air? Should they stop him broadcasting other things? Should they ask him to do a proper apology online? What should be done?
I believe there should be some sanctions, not take him off of Netflix because he's making a living off of it, but that specific episode or joke should be taken off context, because there's no point making fun of a community.
It's been taken off, has it? As far as I'm aware, Paula.
When young children make a mistake, we tell them they need to make an apology.
Yeah.
So that would be a perfect example.
Yeah, and I don't think there has been an apology.
Not that I know of.
I think it has to be taken off, the specific episode about.
Do you think he's broken the Race Relations Act legislation? And should he be prosecuted for it?
You wouldn't be able to say it about another racial group.
Would have been sanctions.
It is very difficult because even if you take it off Netflix, it's out there now, isn't it? I think the apology should be there. But if you think about old films, they all now come with a warning, don't they, about language and that things are inappropriate. You know, if it's going to be there, let's put something there to say that people can at least make that choice about whether they're going to watch it or not. I do think there needs to be an apology, and I think it needs to be worded in such a way as that young people understand why it was inappropriate.
That's very helpful, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't. I mean, I remember when I was at school, it was loosely touched upon that the Holocaust included, but loosely. In you know, it wasn't significant. It wasn't significantly made clear. In terms of sorry to be specific about Ipswich, but you know, we are an example of a part of the country with a significant Roma community. In the time that the community sort of first. I mean, how old is is it sort of 6-7 years? Is it in terms of the community in Ipswich? Is it?
Yeah, well, the first parents arrived in 2010, in 2010. So it's been like 12 years.
In that time, in the 12-year time, have you seen improvements, I guess, in terms of the extent to which people feel settled, feel like they're improvements in understanding of them, of your community, but also the extent to which, as a community, you feel fully at ease in the town and in the country more generally?
Well, yeah, I tend to say that Ipswich is my second home. Yes, we have seen great improvements. There are things that need to be done a lot more, but I've seen improvements, and I believe that together with the professionals and people from the community, we can do a lot more to keep children in school, have higher rates of attendance, and accessing funds as a association, as a Ipswich Roma association. We need to know where to go and access funds in order to help the community in a much broader way.
Generally, the Roma community in Ipswich is a settled community.
Yes.
And most of the community are living in
houses.
Yeah, houses
Yes.
and properties, etc.
Yes.
Has that increased in the 12-year period? Like
Yes.
the proportion who live in this sort of house as opposed to not?
Yes. I believe most of the Roma people live in a house. The nomadic lifestyle that some of our colleagues have experienced is different from the Romanian community. When they come here, they live in a house because that's what they happened in the past. Okay, back in 40, 50 years ago, they used to have that style of nomadic lifestyle, going with the caravan from a place to another. But this doesn't happen very much back in Romania, and that's why they are settled. They look for a house here. They don't look for a caravan. It's different from what we experience.
Thank you.
Can I just ask you, Paul, if you could just say, going back to the Jimmy Carr issue, just briefly, you said it had impacted on the children. How did that manifest itself? Can you explain it?
We're talking about it, and anything that impacts children talk about. So the children were talking about it, and we dealt with it as we always would in our school and talked about it with them. Quite a few of the parents actually mentioned, I'm on the gate every morning so I can see the parents. Quite a few of them mentioned it and were quite hurt by it. But they were very, very hurt by the laughter around the room.
I also noticed all of you called it a joke, which of course it isn't a joke.
No.
I mean, I know why you were saying that. I mean, I'm from a Jewish background, and I know if that had been said about, which is quite easily could have said, it would have been there would have been uproar. And I just found it fascinating. There was a bit of fuss, but nothing in comparison to any other ethnic group, I think. And I think Netflix should. I know you said about that it's still out there on YouTube or whatever it is, but I think if Netflix made a point, it's a symbol, very important symbol to say this is not acceptable. So I thought it was very symbolic that one. I mean, I'm a huge believer in free speech, and normally I say, all this stuff is, you've got to live and let live. But this, I thought, there are boundaries, and I just thought this is unacceptable. To joke about the Holocaust is just unacceptable. I'm very interested to know about about the impact, and I think it plays into some of the comments that made in the first panel as well, about the way these communities are seen, that somebody can say this and get away with it and be paid, no doubt, millions of pounds or dollars or whatever it is that they get paid for doing this. Can I just finally ask you, going back to the early intervention, I think a lot of these problems could be solved by early intervention, the proper targeting, because we know that these communities are going to struggle at school, just as we found out in our White Working Class Disadvantage report. And the government investing in family hubs and all these kind of things, there's 500 million announced in the budget. But if you had a brilliant early intervention programme that targeted the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities, how much would it work, and how much money would be needed? You may not know the answer to that, but you could possibly write to us. But what would be an ideal thing? I mean, to me, it has to be you going to the family homes and working with the parents, helping them with, as Caroline said, about literacy and numeracy and all these kind of things. But what would an ideal early intervention programme be? I'll start with you, Marius, please, and then we'll wrap up after this.
Well, I don't know the exact number. There is need of funding in order to tackle a lot of problems and matters. But I believe that if we, have the right advice and somebody to advise us to go to the right people in order to access some funding to start some ACERT classes or literacy classes for parents, and invite them and have our own, how should I say, a community hall where we could meet and promote the good values of the community.
If you invite them to a place, a lot may not come.
True, but we could have people from within the community inviting along with the professionals, because they would then be, oh look, that's a guy from my community, I will go there, So that's one thing we could do.
You need a designated health visitor who specifically works with GRT communities and will go onto sites and will provide inoculations, will provide health checks, and that's a first way of gaining that level of trust. You then also need early years funding for 2-year-olds for GRT pupils, because they don't qualify for 2-year-old funding. So if they qualify for 2-year-old funding, we could have them in nursery.
Why don't they qualify?
Because they don't claim any benefits,
right,
generally. And schools need pupil premium money assigning to these children. That can be monitored in the same way as all pupil premium is, but it's specifically for these children because they come with no funding, and all of your data is suggesting that they are the most disadvantaged children in education, and they've got no funding attached to them at all.
As my colleague said, we really need fundings to help these people. Especially in the last period, we travelled the settled status way, that we really struggled, because most of the parents wouldn't know what to do, where to go, and they end up having no settled status. As a school, we tried, I personally tried to help them, but we didn't have fundings to hire professionals to do it. And we end up, children didn't have it. One of the parents gave birth and they asked for money at the hospital, and she's living here for quite a long time and she had no help. We really need fundings for the Roma community to help with education and every public service that they can...
And then we have a last quick question from Caroline.
I think what Pauline said is absolutely right, and making sure that you've got members of the community being employed by the public services that support them, because that's the quickest way to get the trust in there. And that can sometimes be a challenge in terms of HR and qualifications and things, but there are people out there who want to work within that public services. I think that would help massively.
Thank you. Caroline.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you about Paula. You made a sort of generalised statement there, they don't claim benefits. I wanted to ask you about that. Is that because the community have such a high income that they don't qualify? Is it a lack of awareness of the benefits? Is it a cultural belief that they don't want to accept help from the state? What is it that...
It's a cultural belief that you should support yourself.
Right, okay.
And that's what it is.
What percentage don't claim benefits of the?
So in my school, out of the 91 families, I think we have about 6 who claim free school meals.
What about, is that the case with the others?
I believe more would be entitled to it if they chose to claim it. They would be entitled. I believe more families would be entitled.
Possibly, but it's a moot point if I'm honest. They won't claim the benefits.
Right. But you think they would claim the nursery places?
That nursery funding, if they were entitled to pupil premium, they would be able to get their 2-year-old funding.
You think they would accept?
I know they would take it. Yeah.
Most of the parents from our school, they didn't know about it until I told them to, and I've helped them to apply for it if they are entitled, and I personally helped them fill in the application, and they were successful. They could get free school meals. It's more lack of understanding and knowing that they could have it.
Nationally,